Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan, and welcome to our series on the US elections, America Votes. I have with me Ambassador Arun Singh. Many of you are aware he was India's ambassador to the United States. He has also served in France and Israel. And from New York, I have with me Professor W.P.S. Sidhu. He is a specialist on disarmament and security issues. Ambassador Arun Singh. In the context of China, do you see China as a kind of a convergence point for India and the US in terms of foreign policy, security policy, perhaps even trade?
So Surya, I have studied India-US relations deeply for some time, and my sense is that the relationship has been impacted at any point of time by broadly four factors. First, what is the global priority that the US has set for itself? And therefore, what is the relationship with India in the framework of that global priority? Second, within the framework of its global priority, what is the role that it sees for Pakistan? Because then that impacts on India. Third, within the framework of US global interest priority, what is its relationship with China? And then that has an impact on India. And finally, what is the strength of the India-US bilateral relationship? Now, given all this, in today's context, if you see the statements, messages coming out from the United States, the primary concern for the US in the global context is the rise of China and the technological, economic, and potentially military challenge from China. So repeatedly, there is a focus on that. They say they want to move away from a focus on the challenge of terrorism to the challenge of great power rivalry, where they also speak about the challenge from Russia, which is mainly a military challenge, not so much an economic and technological challenge. But in terms of comprehensive challenge, they see that as coming from China. Now, in the framework of that, clearly, the relationship with India is an important relationship for the US, not to contain China, because I don't think that is their strategy, because economically and otherwise they're heavily integrated with China. But as the Americans say, to shape the environment around the rise of China, so that there are certain natural constraints on the kind of military, economic, strategic policies that China can exercise. So that's the broad strategy. So I think in the framework of that, US will clearly find a lot of interest in deepening the relationship with India. And I think from India's perspective, there is a convergence. We are ourselves seeing a challenge from China, with China's GDP now being 5 times India's, military expenditure being 4 times India's, China's footprint increasing in the Indian Ocean, in the countries around India. So we also need friends and partners that we work with so that we can manage the challenge we are facing from China.
Professor Sidhu, how do you see it? What's the view from the US?
Well, I would very much agree with what Ambassador Arun Singh has said, and maybe just add one more element. I think the other challenge that we tend to underestimate in the context of China is also the political challenge. In addition to the military, economic, and technological one, the way that China is now building up its global image, for example, through the UN, this level of activism we haven't seen in a very long time, and also not just militarily, but the Belt Road Initiative, its access into Africa, a lot of that is also driven by politics. And this is a new element, if you like, in the U.S.-India relationship. I think there have been many other drivers already which were pushing this relationship closer between U.S. and India, and China perhaps is maybe the most recent one of them. One that we again tend to underestimate is the role of the Indian diaspora. Particularly here, and how their rise within the system here, right across the board, in the private sector, in government, in NGOs, in civil society, in academia, among others, has really also been a major sort of driver on that. In that context, I think China provides both a convergence, but also a degree of divergence. I think convergence to the extent that, exactly as Ambassador Arun Singh was saying, that there are mutual concerns related to security, related to economics. But I think a slight divergence there is that the US economy is far more intertwined with the Chinese economy. And unfortunately, at this stage, India does not offer an alternative for US business to China. That's a missed opportunity because that would really have led to a greater convergence. I think the areas of divergence really are number one on, and maybe I'll have a slightly different take here than Ambassador Singh, that some elements in the US think about containment of China. They're not necessarily using that word, but if you look at the freedom of navigation operations, for example, FONOPs, there is an element of trying to sort of assert the containment, which, as you know, India is not so keen on, or at least, formalizing that. There are other ways to sort of do that. The second aspect is, and I know we'll talk about this, there's a lot of focus on the Quad part of it, the military part, but less so, for example, on the East Asia Summit, which is the political pillar and leg, where I think you should expect a more India-US relationship. And then third, of course, is economics, where we've talked about India perhaps is the weakest in that context.
So do you believe the Quad could be, it's in its early stages right now, but do you see it taking on a kind of shape, perhaps as some kind of an Asian NATO? Is that the thinking in the US?
No, I think everybody is trying to see how it evolves, because, as you know, the Quad was first started in 2007, but after 2008, it withered away for a while because Australia did not show much interest. But last few years, it has picked up. There have been regular meetings at the official level, and now the foreign ministers have met twice. And on 6th of October, they met also in an in-person meeting at the time of COVID in Japan. And although this was the second meeting of the foreign ministers, this is the first time they have met outside the framework of the UN, because the last meeting was in New York itself. So I think there is a political signal that they're attaching more and more importance to this framework for interaction. Also, when COVID impacted in March, after that, at the senior official level, there have been regular interactions of the Quad, sometimes with other countries included, such as South Korea, Vietnam, New Zealand, sometimes Israel, Brazil, to see how they could look at having a coordinated response to deal with the challenge of COVID. And then the trade ministers of Australia, India, and Japan had one meeting to look at supply chain resilience initiative, and therefore kind of an alternative supply chain framework to deal with the fact that concentration of the supply chain in and through China doesn't provide for stability and security. So an effort is being made to see if the Quad can become more relevant, can have more activity, economic, technological issues related to data, response to health concerns, response to climate. So step by step, we'll have to see. So far, it has not really been infused with a military dimension, because so far all the countries have been careful about not signaling that it is a military attempt in response to China. Because even countries in ASEAN so far are a little wary of Quad, because they don't see a role for themselves when the Quad comes in. And then again, statements coming from the US, for example, talk of Quad having a very important regional role. But the statements coming from India talk of a regional and global role for Quad, and signaling that Quad is a framework for cooperation also for global issues, not just in the context of China. So I would not call it an Asian NATO. And even statements from the US now are saying that in today's context, you don't have to look at the kind of response the US did after the Second World War, when it set up NATO. You have to look at different kinds of partnership arrangements and not a formalized military alliance structure. So I think Quad would probably head in that direction.
Professor Sidhu, what's your view?
So Quad is very interesting in the sense that it actually operationalized before it was formalized. And what I mean by that is in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, you had precisely these four countries coming together to do humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And so that's already sort of set out in some ways the stage of what the Quad intends to do. Start from a kind of non-threatening, more cooperative, humanitarian assistance dimension. And then that has been formalized over a period of time, starting from 2004 onwards. I have actually argued that what you're seeing in the Quad is the basis for something like a NATO, but with some important distinctions. And for that, I think it's also important for us to recognize what are the commonalities and differences with the European NATO or the traditional NATO. Number one, by and large, NATO was a top-down approach. It was really one country sort of, corralling all the allies together and then, moving forward on that. Number two, as the first Director General of NATO, said very clearly, NATO had three objectives: to keep the Soviets out, Germany down, and the US in. Now, if you take that same logic for the Asian or for the Quad, then I would argue that the three objectives could well be to keep China down, I'll explain that a little bit as to where the difference is. The US in, and that's an important element. To keep China out, to keep the US in, and to keep Japan militarily down, not economically, not politically, because of the history of Japan in this region during World War II. So I think those are the three elements that you can see developing and evolving in this context. But we also need to remember that even the classic NATO, the European NATO, transatlantic NATO, is not only a military organization. It's equally a political organization. It's where countries are coming together to discuss common issues. The fact that they're all democracies is something that they pride themselves on. So I think Quad is distinct because it's a bottom-up approach. Almost all four countries have an equal voice. And I think Ambassador Singh is absolutely right. It has to expand. So you are going to go into Quad Plus. And here again, if you look at NATO's relationship with Russia now as a partnership for peace country, maybe that's something that might be considered vis-a-vis China. It's too early to say at the moment, but perhaps it could go in that direction too. So I think there is a lot of potential, but I entirely agree. Military is not the primary objective. So in that sense, it is very distinct from the transatlantic organization.
Ambassador, would you say the Trump administration has gone the extra mile when it comes to, our concerns about Pakistan, terrorism, etc.?
So I'm not sure. Even in the earlier administrations, if you saw the Bush administration or the Obama administration, on the subject of terrorism, clearly they were supportive of India's concerns. It is just that when they needed Pakistan, because of what they were doing in Afghanistan, they provided some space to Pakistan. Now, even under the Trump administration, in the initial phase, they came down very hard on Pakistan. President Trump spoke about Pakistan hoodwinking the US. He cut assistance to Pakistan. But ever since the efforts started to get into a dialogue with the Taliban, and they realized that to have a successful dialogue with the Taliban, they needed Pakistan to be supportive of that. The criticism of Pakistan is not there at the public level. The only thing they have done is that to keep the pressure on Pakistan through the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF process, they have kept Pakistan on the grey list. And therefore, the message clearly that you will remain under watch because of the support you provide to terrorist groups, and we will use this mechanism to keep the pressure on you to make sure you are cooperating in the context of the Taliban. And so long as Pakistan continues to provide that cooperation, which they have done so far, the otherwise public pressure on Pakistan has taken off. So I would say the US is guided by its own interests. And of course, because they're maintaining pressure on Pakistan in FATF, it certainly serves India's interest, because as a result of that, Pakistan has to publicly not be as supportive of the Lashkar-e-Toiba and some of the other organizations as they otherwise are. So to that extent, helpful to us. But yes, one has to be mindful that it's driven by their own security interests.
Professor, your view?
Well, in India's desire to see a US president sort of boxing in and cutting off all ties with Pakistan is sheer fantasy. The one thing that Pakistan has that India will never be able to offer is it's willing to be a client state.
Yeah.
It's willing. It's a classic rentier state. It's willing to sell its services in some ways to the highest bidder, and we've seen this time and time again through the existence of Pakistan, and it's going to remain. It will remain crucial because of its geostrategic position vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Afghanistan, vis-a-vis Central Asia, links with Saudi Arabia. So at best, what you can really expect is to see if you can use the US concerns about appropriate behavior of states to have Pakistan be more in line with what you would expect to be a normal state. And some of this actually depends on, evolution within Pakistan's own political system. As it moves away from becoming a more, militarily beholden, becomes a more, quote unquote, normal democratic state, the less you're going to have, the US being able to just dictate it as a rentier state as well. So that's a fundamental element. But I think, I entirely agree that to think any one president is going to sever ties completely or make a difference is simply not likely to happen. Pakistan just makes itself very valuable in different contexts, and it will always be able to do that.
But about Pakistan becoming a normal state, I mean, that's also a bit of fantasy there, isn't it? I mean, they've been on the same course for the last 70 years. Professor?
Yes, and I think that will come from these other instruments, along with, for example, the FATF, in the other global context. That's the way it's going to be done, not necessarily by severing ties. In an interesting way, it may actually not, the isolation of Pakistan may not be the way to go. It may be, in fact, to engage them more in the global context, which then makes them more vulnerable to these various global institutions for their own interests and benefits. And there, I think, again, we need to look beyond the executive office here, but certainly also look at the Congress, for example, and also in some ways the judiciary too, I would kind of argue, and as well as the private sector. So all of those elements, I think, are going to be important players. And in this sense, I know one of your earlier questions was, what is it that the US might want from India, is certainly to be more attractive for US investments and business, because that's going to be another key driver.
I have a slightly on the issue of incentivizing Pakistan, because the US has struggled with this policy to incentivize Pakistan or to pressurize Pakistan. And sometimes they've used pressure, sometimes they use incentives. Neither has worked. Because, for example, in 2016, US once again wanted to supply F-16 to Pakistan to incentivize them. They've given them assistance at different times. So I don't believe that engagement itself will lead to more positive results from Pakistan until the message is clear that we will not accept the kind of involvement that you continue with terrorist groups. Because essentially, in the past, it's essentially the United States, China, and Saudi Arabia that have bailed out Pakistan from time to time whenever it has had major troubles. Now their relationship with the US is difficult, their relationship with Saudi Arabia is difficult, and it's now China that's bailing them out. We have to see how China sees its own interests impacted by the kind of support that terrorist groups in Pakistan are receiving. From the US side, I think one would expect that the message has to be clear that any involvement of Pakistan with terrorist groups will not be acceptable. So that's important, whatever be the nature of engagement.
Ambassador?
I agree with that. With just a minor caveat, I agree that on the bilateral level, perhaps the incentive just on the bilateral level doesn't work, but at the multilateral level, if you can build up these other institutions where Pakistan may see it in its interest to be part of and is not because of its behavior, then I think that's what I meant by incentives, not in terms of providing equipment or other such material. Sorry, I apologize for.
Ambassador, US policy towards Iran and Afghanistan, major issues for us?
Well, it's a challenge, because for our own reasons, we need to have a cooperative relationship with Iran. Iran is an important country for us for transit access to Afghanistan, for transit access to Central Asia. It was in the past an important source of energy. There have been cultural and other links with Iran. So it's an important country that we want to have a relationship with. But because the US has a particular approach and difficulties in its relationship with Iran, and because of US sanctions, it's difficult to maintain the kind of energy partnership that we had in the past. And that has certainly meant enhanced costs for India. But when you do a cost benefit of the relationship. So although the Indian government does not formally accept the US unilateral sanctions on Iran, when Indian companies, if they want to buy from Iran and they worry that they would be sanctioned by the US, they also have engagements in the US. So they take decisions in their own interest to cut down on the engagement with Iran. So clearly that's a bit of a challenge. On Afghanistan, we would certainly want that any US drawdown of troops should be conditions-based, should be linked to enduring stability, political security stability in Afghanistan. And if that doesn't happen, certainly it's a matter of concern for us. But then one has to also factor in that the US has been present in Afghanistan for 19 years, and there is now a fatigue in US society and polity related to continued engagement with Afghanistan. So if they don't see that their interests are negatively impacted by their moving out of Afghanistan, they will move out. And one has to accept that. So I think seeing where the situation is, we also have to do our own effort to work towards contributing to enduring stability in Afghanistan.
Professor, your view?
In the case of Iran, I would say this is in fact the one issue where this election would matter. Because if you have a second Trump administration, then the existing policy is likely to continue, which is of staying out of that joint comprehensive plan of action, the sanctions, and essentially trying to box in Iran. If there is a change in administration, then we will certainly see a return to a different Iranian policy, because it was quite clear that the JCPOA was not really about just a nuclear deal. Just like I would argue that the Indo-US nuclear deal was not really about only nuclear power or energy. And that is really about how do you try to accommodate Iran in that broader region. And it was really the start of that, which was obviously interrupted by the advent of the Trump administration. So you may see a switch back to that approach. But I think when you're talking about India's interests with Iran and how India might want to deal with that, Ambassador Singh has laid it out very well in the US-India context. But there is one more important player, and that's Israel. How Israel would react to a closer tie-up vis-a-vis India and Iran and how that might impact on India-Israeli relationships is another important element as well. So that may, by the way, also constrain the Biden administration's approach to Iran as to how far they can possibly go. So Israel would certainly have to be part of any such sort of arrangement on that context. I think in the case of Afghanistan, I totally agree with Ambassador Singh's assessment on that. I think there the only issue is that India in some ways has been out of that discussion for a very long time. And it's not, and the fact that it did not want to get engaged or involved as part of the broader NATO discussion may have been, something of a missed opportunity, because now at the moment you're now beholden to US-Pakistan interests in some ways, or even China, which has become actually more kind of proactive in that context, leaving India also then more beholden on Iran, which again has posed problems and challenges for India as well. So certainly, I think one of the countries which is likely to be negatively impacted by the US withdrawal and the return of the Taliban in the power structure is going to be India, because while the US may draw an understanding with Taliban that it's not going to impact American interests either there or worldwide, that India has no such guarantee, and that's something that India would have to then sort of deal with as well.
We now come to the last lot of questions, and this is about Kashmir and human rights and NAA and all that, CAA. Professor, what's the view from there? The Trump administration appears to have given us a fair amount of leeway, I'm assuming that that could change under a Biden administration.
Well, I think when we're thinking about India-US relations, we obviously tend to think in monolithic terms and only think in terms of the executive. But here, obviously, the legislatures in both countries, but certainly in the US, are equally, if not more important. And so they are likely to raise many of these issues in different sort of contexts. Now, while these are purely in the domestic ambit, they would nonetheless have these kind of global repercussions. And from where I'm sitting in New York, I can, there's going to be a greater repercussion on this in India's role on the Security Council. Because we've already seen China use, for entirely different reasons, the Kashmir issue, and it's going to keep recurring on the 2 years that India is there. If nothing else, it's a terrible distraction, and for Ambassador Singh and his successors and colleagues to try and deflect this situation all the time, which is then taking away from the broader kind of perspective of what India may want to do and achieve in the UN Security Council. And to that extent, I think it also unnecessarily perhaps gives the US or some establishments within the US an additional stick if they want to so use it. So I think to that extent, I think it kind of weakens India's stand and position.
So my assessment would be that the Democratic Party, some of their leaders have articulated a position related to India's action in Kashmir in August last year, or on CAA, because that's based on their own kind of politics that they have within the United States, where they have to show themselves as being more forward-leaning, upfront on issues that defined as human rights. But Joe Biden himself has said publicly, in, for example, a video message that he had put out on 15th August on the occasion of our Independence Day, and those who work closely with him have also articulated separately that any discussions on these issues with India would be a discussion among friends. And all societies have challenges. And if you look at the United States, look at the kind of problems the United States is facing regarding the racial issue, regarding gerrymandering of districts, regarding voter suppression. So there are many things that the US itself has to explain. So when you start looking at challenges that societies face, issues related to human rights, I don't think there's need for India to be on the defensive in any way. We have our challenges, but so do all other societies. So does the United States. And you can have a free and frank discussion among friends where you discuss what your challenges are, how are you trying to address these issues. And if you really look at where the problem of human rights is, it's in China, in Xinjiang, in Tibet, what they've done in Hong Kong. Yeah. And the challenge that a totalitarian Chinese state is now posing to Western societies, to other countries, that's the real challenge. And in fact, the US Secretary of State and the Education Secretary have just a couple of days ago sent out a letter to heads of all universities in the US and heads of schools saying that Confucius institutes that they have given space to, or in both the universities and schools, they should now try and end those. That's the challenge, the real challenge that US society is facing. And whatever differences, of course, they have related to India that can be worked upon, because there is a broad bipartisan support in the US, be it in the executive, be it in the legislature, for deepening the relationship with India.
On that positive note, Professor, I'd like to bring this discussion to a close. Thank you very much for your insight and your perspective. Ambassador Singh, Professor Sidhu, thank you for talking to StratNews Global.
Thank you.